No halt to settlements, no right of return, and a demilitarized Palestinian state. That's how Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu views the future of the Middle East. But not only is it at odds with the Palestinians, it's increasingly at odds with the vision outlined by US President Barack Obama. Coming up, Inside Story dissects the two men's visions and asks, what chance peace? Hello there, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. So the cards are on the table now. The leaders of Israel and the United States have laid out their visions for the Middle East. And perhaps a little surprisingly, they're not the same. Benjamin Netanyahu delivered his speech on national security and the future of the peace process at Bar-Ilan University near Tel Aviv, widely seen as an answer to Barack Obama's speech in Cairo, also at a university, as it happens, where he reached out to Muslims and the Arab world, hoping to improve America's image. Netanyahu broached most of the same issues as Obama, but was resolute in his message. Israel will not concede to the demands of the US president or the Palestinians without certain conditions. He also said he knew the root cause of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it's the Arab world's refusal to accept Israel as a Jewish state. But as the man they call Bibi began his speech, there seemed to be an air of conciliation and dialogue in the offing.
I appeal tonight to the leaders of the Arab countries and say, let us meet, let us talk peace, let us make peace. I'm willing to meet at any time, at any place, in Damascus, in Riyadh, in Beirut, and in Jerusalem as well.
But it's the rest of the speech that's got people talking and seemingly put Israel on something of an ideological collision course with the US. Let's bring in our guests now to discuss it all. Patrick Seal, a leading British writer on the Middle East, joins us today from Paris. In London is Abdul Bari Atwan, the editor-in-chief of Al-Quds Al-Arabi newspaper. And rounding out our panel in Washington, D.C. is Aaron Miller. He's a former advisor to 6 US Secretary of State on Arab-Israeli negotiations. So some interesting stuff, I'm sure, to come from Mr. Miller. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining us. This is how we're going to do the show today. Rather than just hear what Benjamin Netanyahu had to say at Bar-Ilan, we're going to directly compare it to what President Obama said in his speech in Cairo on June 4. The reason being, and we've sort of touched on this already, is that even though this conflict is a Palestinian-Israeli one, and that should not be lost sight of, what the US says is being viewed with equal and, dare I say, sometimes more importance. So here we go. Netanyahu and Obama, 11 days apart, call and response on the issue of a Palestinian state.
So let there be no doubt. The situation for the Palestinian people is intolerable. And America will not turn our backs on the legitimate Palestinian aspiration for dignity, opportunity, and a state of their own. But if we see this conflict only from one side or the other, then we will be blind to the truth. The only resolution is for the aspirations of both sides to be met through 2 states where Israelis and Palestinians each live in peace and security.
If
we receive this guarantee of demilitarization and Israel's security needs, and if Palestinians recognize Israel as a state of the Jewish people, then we will be prepared in a future peace agreement to reach a solution where a demilitarized Palestinian state exists alongside the Jewish state.
Aaron Miller in Washington, let me come to you first of all. Who, and I'm talking about anyone in the world, Barack Obama, the United States, the international community, anyone who is going to accept this kind of state, not just a demilitarized state, but there'd be no control, as I understand, over airspace, no military alliances. Is anyone going to accept that?
First of all, I think you're taking the speech as a measure and an indication and as a response to the Arab-Israeli problem. This speech was designed to deal not with the Arab-Israeli issue at all, not to talk to Palestinians or Arabs, but essentially to address what the Prime Minister saw was his problem in Washington. And to the degree that the administration has already this morning welcomed the statement on behalf of demilitarized Palestinian statehood, the Prime Minister, at least I believe, has bought himself some political space and time with the Americans. Now, the speech has been roundly criticized and already rejected for obvious reasons by the Arabs and by the Palestinians. But the purpose of this speech was not about that. The purpose of this speech was to diffuse a potentially looming confrontation by giving the president something and buying the prime minister additional political space and time. We don't know, of course, how the administration really is reacting to this. Are they disappointed? Are they going to up the ante? Are they prepared for a serious brouhaha and a crisis with the Israelis? We don't know any of that. All we know is what we've seen. The prime minister has endorsed a demilitarized Palestinian state, and the administration has this morning, or actually yesterday, welcomed that.
Patrick Seal, does it surprise you in that sense that the Obama administration has given it something of a seal of approval already, and yet a lot of other people are thinking this sounds extremely controversial, completely demilitarized state?
It's far from a seal of approval, but I think we have to recognize that these are early days. The battle of wills is just beginning, and it's going to take several months before we see clearly who emerges on top. What one can say, I think, is that rarely have the Israelis been so worried and so anxious as they are today, not perhaps since the early 60s, the Kennedy period. So Netanyahu is very much on the defensive. What he has done, it seems to me, is outline, as any good negotiator would, his maximalist position. He's put all the conditions possible. I've identified at least 6 major conditions in his speech which the Palestinians have to fulfill. As I say, these are early days. The negotiation is still to come. We shouldn't read, I think, too much into his early statement.
Let's keep moving on and look at some of our specific issues in these 2 speeches. Now the issue of settlements.
Israel's right to exist cannot be denied, neither can Palestine's. The United States does not accept the legitimacy of continued Israeli settlements. This construction violates previous agreements and undermines efforts to achieve peace. It is time for these settlements to stop.
We have no intention of building new settlements or of expropriating additional land for existing settlements. But there is a need to allow settlers to lead normal lives, to allow mothers and fathers to raise their children like families around the world. The settlers are neither the enemies of the people nor the enemies of peace. They are our brothers and sisters.
Abdul Bari Atwan in London, let's bring you into the conversation now. Settlements, it is a big issue, it is an ongoing issue. How do you feel, having heard those 2 little sound bites, the 2 issues collide or otherwise between the US and Israel? Because what Benjamin Netanyahu seems to be saying is forget about the 40% of the West Bank that's been taken already and, forget about stopping natural growth.
Well, actually, I'm shocked by first the American reaction when the American administration said this is a step forward. I don't know what's the step backward in this case. I think, Benjamin Netanyahu put a lot of obstacles in front of any negotiation when he said he used the terminology of a Jewish state and he asked the Arab to recognize it more than 5 times. So he mentioned it 10 times and asked the Arab to recognize it more than 5 times. So the question is not settlement. The question is, Benjamin Netanyahu, he never recognized that the West Bank, Gaza Strip is a Palestinian land. He said, okay, they can have a state on the Israeli land. So settlement is insignificant here because, nothing left for the Palestinian. As you mentioned, Kamahl, 40% already taken from the West Bank. And he is challenging now the American administration, saying to them, look, I'm not going to freeze the settlement. I believe in national growth of the settlers, but what about the national growth of the Palestinian in the occupied territories, even in 1948 inside Israel itself? The Palestinians are not allowed to have national growth like the Israelis. They are prevented from building houses, having their lands, so it's a huge restriction on them. The Israeli government, which is supposed to be their government, never build them houses the way they are building for the Israelis. So I think it is a challenge to the American administration. It is a challenge to Obama himself. It is a slap on the face of the new American president. What he is going to do, how he is going to react, I think we have to see.
To play devil's advocate, though, he did say that Israel has no intention of building any new settlements. That's a step, isn't it?
But nothing left, you know. If they have 40% for the West Bank, what's left for the Palestinians to actually? So I think they grabbed most of the lands. They have about 500,000 settlers in the West Bank and Jerusalem. So what's left for the Palestinians? And what, you know? Okay, they want to have all of it. Okay, they can have all of it. It's what can we do? You know, if the American administration, which is the major sponsor of Israel, and it's supposed to be the leader of the free words, are not saying to them, look, you know, the whole settlements are illegal and should be removed completely. But now they are so happy because, you know, he mentioned the Palestinian state, and as Patrick Seal said, you know, there are more than 7 or 6 conditions in order to reach this. So I believe it is non-starter from the beginning.
Let's keep moving on. The issue of refugees now and the right of return.
On the other hand, it is also undeniable that the Palestinian people, Muslims and Christians, has suffered in pursuit of a homeland. For more than 60 years, they've endured the pain of dislocation. Many wait in refugee camps in the West Bank, Gaza, and neighboring lands for a life of peace and security that they have never been able to lead. They endure the daily humiliations, large and small, that come with occupation.
There must be a clear understanding that the Palestinian refugee problem will be resolved outside Israel's borders. For it is clear that any demand to resettle Palestinian refugees within Israel undermines Israel's continued existence as the state of the Jewish people.
Aaron Miller, if we're talking about differences between the way the US and Israel view things, and this is an interesting one because you hear Benjamin Netanyahu unequivocal there, this is a problem which will have to exist outside of Israel. And yet the way Barack Obama was speaking, it was very much, yes, it's a terrible thing that's happened to the Palestinians, but I'm not actually offering anything for them.
Look, on the refugee issue, of the 4 core issues that need to be resolved if you're going to have an Israeli-Palestinian conflict-ending agreement, Jerusalem, security, borders, and refugees. The Prime Minister or any Israeli government is going to find its greatest sympathy and the greatest resonance for its positions on the refugee issue. Going back to Camp David, the Clinton parameters, American-sanctioned discussions on these issues, the United States essentially agrees that Palestinians should have an unlimited right of return to the new Palestinian state, but not to Israel proper. And again, I'm not moralizing or editorializing on this, I'm simply reporting. The Prime Minister's position is frankly not going to be that much different than the position that this current administration would take on the refugee issue or the previous administration would take. So once again, I fear what's happened is that the administration has gotten the Arab and Palestinian world all excited about the prospects of a fundamental change in its relationship with Israel, its view of the core issues, its willingness to deal with the settlement issue if the Israelis don't comply, in a way that's fundamentally different than all of its predecessors, American predecessors. And frankly, I don't buy that. I think the administration will be different. I think it is more committed, but I think that the notion that somehow we're going to punish the Israelis, sanction them, cut their military aid, be active in the UN to introduce UN security, I think all of this is a fantasy.
Patrick Seal, I thought it was interesting in Benjamin Netanyahu's speech that he seemed to have a lot of ideas. He seemed to say Palestinian state must be demilitarized, this and that. But when it came to this particular issue, he didn't actually offer a solution. He just said it can't happen inside Israel. My question to you, and just for your thoughts on the matter, is how do you solve this issue outside of Israel's borders?
Right. Well, nobody, I think, including on the Arab side, expects a large-scale return of Palestinian refugees to Israel proper. They might demand or ask for a token number, but certainly not a very large number. That is really out. However, what the Palestinians want is a recognition by Israel of responsibility for the destruction of their country And of course, what the Palestinian refugees will expect is compensation. Now, massive compensation. In my view, two funds have to be created, two large, multi-billion international funds, one for the Palestinian refugees, and the other, of course, for the Israeli settlers to persuade them to leave the occupied territories. Because we're not just talking about a freeze of settlements. We have to dismantle most of those settlements. Indeed, all of them, except those who might agree to live within a Palestinian state. Now, that is why we have to consider this as the beginning of a long negotiation.
And you think that's workable?
Many tough issues.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you think that's workable, this idea of the funds and the compensation rather than the actual return?
Well, of course, and I think that has been more or less understood. As I say, a token return, a recognition of Israel for responsibility of what it did in 1948. And then, of course, this massive fund, which, of course, everybody has to contribute to, the Gulf states, the international community, to compensate. It's always been return or compensation. And because the money wasn't there, the Palestinians have been allowed to rot, as it were. So and of course, unless the money is there, the settlers, most of the settlers won't want to up sticks and return to Israel. So these two funds are very, very important, and I think this is an issue which has not yet been dealt with properly.
Now, the issue of Jerusalem. President Obama didn't mention it specifically in his speech, but his views have been well documented. After initially calling for it to remain the undivided capital of Israel, Obama then kind of backpedaled and just went to the capital of Israel, not undivided, saying Jerusalem was a final status issue for the two sides to sort out themselves. Benjamin Netanyahu, on the other hand, is adamant.
Regarding the remaining important issues that will be discussed as part of the final settlement, my positions are known. Israel needs defensible borders, and Jerusalem must remain the united capital of Israel, with continued religious freedom for all faiths.
Abdul Bari, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. It is such a big issue, very emotional issue, of course, for the Palestinians as well. Do you get the feeling, though, that Barack Obama wants to stay out of this one as much as he possibly can?
Yes. You know, what amazed me, the American administration always asking Hamas to recognize and commit itself to the previous agreements between the Israeli and the Palestinian Authority. Here, we have three final status issues: refugees, Jerusalem, and the right of return for the Palestinian people, and the settlement. So these three issues: Jerusalem, settlement, and the refugees. When it comes to Jerusalem, Netanyahu said, that's it. This is the eternal capital, eternal united capital of Israel. So he actually did not commit himself to Oslo agreement, which was signed between the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, and the Israeli. The second thing, he said, you know, it's not negotiable. So how can we accept this? How the Palestinian accept this? How the Arab can accept this? You know, Jerusalem with its Christian and Muslim holy sites under the Israeli control, full Israeli control. This is definitely a setback. This will upset and provoke about 1.5 billion Muslim all over the world. And when it comes, just come a little bit, we have to go back to the refugee question. Personally, I am a Palestinian refugee. I wouldn't accept any solution which doesn't actually allow me to go back to my hometown, which is Ashdod. So, and I believe there are 6 million Palestinian refugees who are like me. It is not a question of compensation. It is a question of recognizing our right to return. Why the Jews can go back to Israel from Russia, from Ukraine, from United States, from Golders Green in London. And personally, me and my family who belong to that lands for thousands of years are not allowed to go. No, I'm not going to accept money. I want to accept a recognition of my right of return. After that, what I do with it, this is a completely different story. Jerusalem, refugees, and the settlement should be actually recognized as the final status issues and should be discussed between the Palestinian and the Israelis. But, you know, to say that no refugees, to say no Jerusalem, to say that the settlement will continue to grow, I think this is the end of the whole peace process. And to say that the Palestinians should accept Israel as a Jewish state, it means 1,200,000 Arabs living in Israel will be kicked out. It means also, you know, that the Arabs in Jerusalem, they don't have the right to stay in Jerusalem, whether they are Christian or Muslim, simply because they are not Jews. Right. I believe, you know, this is destroyed completely President Obama's speech, and he will never win the hearts and the minds of the Muslim unless he says to Netanyahu, enough is enough.
Gentlemen, we're starting to run down the clock now, so I want to just quickly look at some international reactions, starting at the White House, where spokesman Robert Gibbs says President Barack Obama welcomes the important step forward in Israel's Prime Minister's speech, while the EU's Foreign Affairs Commissioner Benita Ferrero-Waldner called it a very important first step. But of course, many other steps should follow. Nothing so positive from the Palestinians, though. Chief negotiator Saeb Erekat had this warning, actually for President Obama. He said you can treat Netanyahu as a prime minister above the law and set the whole region on the path of violence, chaos, extremism and bloodletting. Over in Gaza, Hamas spokesman Sami Abu Zuhri said Netanyahu has failed in misleading the Palestinian and Arab opinion. His racist statements and policies on the ground prove his peace claims are lies. And Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak was adamant Netanyahu's speech will only obstruct chances to achieve peace. And during a tour to the region that's taken him to Lebanon, Syria, Israel and the Palestinian territories, including Gaza later in the week, the former US President Jimmy Carter warned Israel is headed for a clash with the United States over the issue of settlements. The former president, who brokered the historic peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1979, already warned previously that the settlements were the biggest hurdle in the Middle East peace process and were illegal. Aaron Miller, a final thought from you, and I think it's kind of building up to the point of wanting to make, and you've said it as well, that even though there seems to be some hope for the Palestinians, or there seemed to be some hope, it's not really headed that way. Even though Jimmy Carter believes there's a clash on the way between Israel and the US, it's probably not in the end, is it?
Well, your show has graphically demonstrated on each of these issues how big the gaps are between the Israeli and Palestinian position. Now, it's my view that Barack Obama does not want to be the president on whose watch, 4 years or 8 years, the two-state solution dies. So I think this guy is very serious. He's very committed. He may well, once it's clear that the Israelis and the Palestinians cannot do much on their own, he may outline his own ideas in an effort to raise the costs to both sides of the prospects of saying no. I think the Americans will do something. Something quite significant. I just don't think the odds of success, frankly, are terribly great.
Patrick Steele, I've got 30 seconds left for a quick thought from you. Where do you think, if I interviewed you in a year's time, do you think we'd be any further on than where we are now?
Definitely. There's no question that Obama is serious. I think he's probably trying to get rid of Netanyahu, or at least force him to reshape his coalition, to bring in Kadima, get rid of Lieberman. There's a lot the United States can do. It can marginalize Israel. It can proceed with its peace plans without consulting Israel. It refrain from backing them automatically at the Security Council. There's a lot it can do and will do. And I think that Netanyahu knows this, and this is the moment of truth. These are his opening demands. They are not his final demands, if he's still there when the deal is done.
Gentlemen, very busy show today, and I thank you for all your thoughts and your contributions. Patrick Steele there in Paris, Abdul Bari Atwan in London, and of course Aaron Miller in Washington DC. Gentlemen, thank you very much. And to you, our viewers, as always, thank you for joining us for Inside Story. You can send a comment or suggestion if you like. Our email address is insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, though, it's goodbye for now.